Welcome back, Sebastian here. So today I wanted to take a look at the 2024 Formula One grid. And I really want to look at who I think is going to be on next year's Formula One grid. So I have the 10 teams in Constructors Championship order currently. I want to take a look at them one by one and look at which ones, who I think will be driving for each team next year. So I'm actually not going to go through in constructors order. I'm actually going to do a slightly different order, and that is the order of kind of most stable driver lineup that I think is going to be easiest to predict for next year, to ones that are probably going to be probably the most volatile, the ones that I think are probably the least predictable for next year. So I'm actually going to start at the team that's third in the Constructors Championship. And the drivers for next year, with a contract until next year at least, are Fernando Alonso and Lance Stroll, who has a contract and basically an infinite contract that we don't know the end of. Alonso's been exceptional this year. He's been basically put the team on his back, and he's basically contributed almost single-handedly to them being third in the Constructors' Championship. Stroll hasn't had a great year. He definitely has also had a really rough year, both on track and off track. Obviously, getting that injury at the start of the year, I think, really set him back the first 3 or 4 races. And he's also had quite a bit of bad luck, but that being said, he hasn't been great either. But at the same time, with Aston where they are at the moment, I think the only way that Stroll would get replaced is if there's a driver that's a significantly higher caliber who would be wanting to sign there. So I'm talking about a Charles Leclerc, George Russell, a Lewis Hamilton, Max Verstappen, that kind of driver. Even maybe a Leclerc assigns a Norris. I do think Norris is better than those two drivers that I mentioned after Piastri and Sainz in comparison. But that being said, I do think Stroll will be sticking around at Aston Martin, just because I don't think there's any driver who's out of contract who would be a significant upgrade over Stroll. Next, I want to actually go to number 4, and that is Leclerc and Sainz. Both drivers have contracts for next year, according to the F1 website, and I know F1 contracts are quite murky, so it's a bit hard to say exactly what everyone's exact contract is. But I'm just going to go off of this source, and we're going to go from there. So both of them have contract for next year. They're both doing pretty well. Obviously, if I do this again for next year's, for the 2025 grade, it could be very different. But Leclerc and Sainz have both been very good. There's no reason that they would change that for next year. Next, let's see. I'm going to go to number 6, and that is Ocon and Gasly. Ocon and Gasly both have contracts for next year. Both have been decent, I think. I don't think either of them have been really that bad. I do think that there is a chance that one of them gets replaced at the end of next year. Which one that is, I don't know. But that being said, I do think Ocon and Gasly will be Alpine's driver lineup for 2024. Next, let's see. McLaren. I think Norris and Piastri apparently both have contracts for next year, and both have been very good. I do think that, especially for Norris's case, it seems like his contract is very ironclad, and there's not really any kind of release clauses. And given that McLaren's sudden turn of form in the last couple of weeks, I don't think there's any reason for either of their drivers to want to leave McLaren for next year. And also, I do think both drivers have been performing very well. So at the same time, the team, I think, will be very happy to keep Piastri and Norris for next year. And now this is where we kind of get into maybe a couple more question marks. So I'm going to go to Mercedes next. Russell has a contract for next year. It's reported that Russell has a contract until 2025. I don't think that's been officially confirmed. And then we have Lewis Hamilton. Lewis Hamilton doesn't have a contract for next year, but that being said, I do think that he will return. I do think that they have made a good step forward from last year. They're still very far off Red Bull. And I know Hamilton dreams of getting that 8th world title. I don't know if he'll be able to get that next year, but I do think that both sides will come together and Hamilton will return at Mercedes for 2024. I don't really think there's any other realistic options, and given how many of the other top drivers in Formula One are tied to contracts for next year, there's not really anyone else obvious that would take that seat. Maybe you could try to pry away like an Albon from a Williams, an Ocon from Alpine, Mick Schumacher, I guess, is another option, although I think he'd probably be pretty far down the list of drivers on Toto Wolff's list if he had to find a replacement. But that being said, I do think Hamilton and Russell will be the drivers at Mercedes for next year. Let's see, this is kind of where things get a bit tricky. We have 5 teams left, and I do think that you could make a solid argument that some of them will change their driver lineup for next year. I think I'm going to go with Alfa Romeo next. So we have Bottas and Zhou. Both of them seems that both of their contracts are up for next year. There's also Théo Pourchaire, second in Formula 2. However, it's his third year in Formula 2. So basically, realistically, I think from the off, it's been those 3 drivers for these 2 seats, and trying to decide which 2 drivers they will pick going forward. I've been watching Formula 2 all year, and I think Pourchaire's been good, but I don't think he's been fantastic. And I don't think he would be a big enough upgrade right now over what they currently have. Even though I know he is very young, he's only 19, so in theory he should have a much higher ceiling. That being said, based on how things have gone this year, and if one of the 2 drivers was especially disappointing, I think they would consider replacing that driver with Pourchaire. But that being said, it kind of feels a bit like the Antonio Giovinazzi at Alfa Romeo situation with him and Raikkonen. Neither driver were really standing out, and because Raikkonen was at the tail end of his career, that was not great for Giovinazzi. But in this case, I think Bottas is still regarded as a pretty decent driver, so the fact that Zhou's not looking completely out of place against him is a really good sign. So for those reasons, I do think that they will stick around with Bottas and Zhou for 2024. Of course, if another driver comes knocking on that door, a Hülkenberg perhaps, wanting to get into that Audi seat when it does become the Audi team, one of those drivers might be in trouble. But for the time being, I think Bottas and Zhou are probably going to be the drivers for Sauber next year. Now, after that, I think things get very tricky. Okay, let's go to Williams. Albon will definitely, or almost certainly, be a Williams driver for next year. Now, his teammate's a bit more of a question mark. Of course, Logan Sargent in his rookie year right now, I think he's been good. I don't think he's been great, though. I think he's had a couple mistakes, not massive mistakes, but he has made mistakes. And the qualifying pace and the race pace has been consistently quite a bit far off of Albon. So I think Williams will have to make a decision at some point. Do they stick around for another year of Albon and Sargent, or do they try to find an alternative? And I think there are a couple options for Williams that they could use instead of Sargent for next year. It's not like a couple years ago with Latifi, where there was not really any realistic options to replace him. There are actually options here, I think, to replace Sargent, which is why I think his position's a bit more precarious. I think current Formula 2 leader Frederick Vesti is a Mercedes junior. Williams has been a place where they've been known to put their juniors. That's where they put Russell. So there's definitely something that could be worked out there. Mick Schumacher, basically he's kind of in the Mercedes driver sphere now. You see him a lot with Toto Wolff. He's been doing test and reserve stuff. I think he is a Formula 1 level driver, but not a fantastic Formula 1 level driver. So I'm not sure. And given Vesti and Sargent's respective junior records and how they fared against each other head to head, I don't think that Vesti would be that much of an upgrade over Sargent, and I'm not sure how much of an upgrade Mick Schumacher would be either. So for those reasons, I'm actually going to keep Sargent around, and I think they will give him one more year next year. And I think depending on how things go next year in 24 and 24, I think it will really be a make or break year for Logan Sargent. So now we've got 3 teams left, and I think next I'm going to go to Red Bull, because I think that's really the key to all this. Of course, we'll have Max Verstappen, who's signed there until 2028, but then we have the other seat. So Sergio Perez currently has a contract for 2024, and you know, there's a saying in Formula One that contracts in Formula One are worth less than the paper they're written on, and we've seen several times in the last 5 or 6 years how sometimes a driver can have a contract for a year, and for one reason or another, they're not driving in that team. Rosberg had a contract 2017, he retired. Perez had a contract for Aston Martin in 2021. They basically used a buyout clause to basically void the contract and bring Seb Vettel in. Let's see, Ricciardo had a contract in McLaren for 2023. De Vries had a contract at AlphaTauri for next year, and obviously he won't be driving for AlphaTauri next year. Perez has been okay, but that being said, I think okay will not cut it at Red Bull, especially next year, given that there's a very good chance, I think, with the cost cap penalties, with the cost cap just in general, that teams like Mercedes, Aston, Ferrari, McLaren could be very close to Red Bull next year. And Perez, I think, has shown this year, especially with his struggles in qualifying, that he is a weak link in that group. I think if you look at all the drivers in the top 5 in the Constructors' Championship, with the exception of Stroll, I think Perez is the weakest of those drivers. So I do think that Red Bull will, if there's a very close championship fight, they would want a driver who can be there consistently and be what Bottas was for Hamilton more often than what Perez is being for Verstappen. I know he had those great moments in 2021, but those were basically 2 very good moments and in an otherwise pretty much a very down year. So for that reason, I think also with how the whole De Vries situation went and why they brought Ricciardo, there is a really simple reason why they brought Ricciardo in. They want to see how he is. They want to compare him against Tsunoda. They want to see which one is better. And I mean, just basing it off of 1 weekend alone, Ricciardo basically was slightly ahead of Tsunoda in qualifying by very, very fine margins. And the race looks good. I know it was 1 race, but it still looked very good. So actually, I'm going to do something crazy. I'm going to predict something different. I think this is actually the first time I've actually predicted anything different. But I'm actually going to go with a Ricciardo and Verstappen Red Bull reunion. And I think that we'll see. I think it will be a 1-year contract. I think there's going to be enough really talented drivers, and I think there's enough question marks with Ricciardo that it will only be a 1-year thing. And if it goes really well, maybe they'll continue for a couple more years. But I do think initially it would be a 1-year contract, show me contract basically. So then we come over here to AlphaTauri, and assuming that Ricciardo gets promoted, I don't think that they would put Perez in the AlphaTauri. I think they will probably keep Tsunoda for 1 more year, just as a good benchmark. And I do think they will bring in their junior driver who's been driving in Super Formula, Liam Lawson. I think he's kind of basically the #1 Red Bull junior in the system right now. If he wins Super Formula, I think there's an excellent chance he'll get that seat. Tsunoda, I think depending on how he does against Ricciardo, he may be at risk of being replaced as well. But at this point, I do think it's highly likely that Tsunoda will be at AlphaTauri next year, or whatever they're rebranding the team as. So last but not least, we have Haas. And Haas, I think both their drivers don't have a contract for next year. That being said, Nico Hülkenberg has been very good. He's fit in very well at Haas. His qualifying performances have been some of the best on the grid, I feel. And while the car isn't really there in the races, I think he's definitely shown enough that the team will want him back, and I think he'll want to stay on the grid next year. Unfortunately, I don't see him really being a candidate to be at that Red Bull. I think age isn't on his side, and I think they probably would prefer Ricciardo, given he has had experience at that team and has had experience at the front. Now for Hülkenberg's teammate, Magnussen's been not great this year. I think I've been a bit disappointed with him, especially in qualifying. The qualifying gap has been quite large, and it seems like it's not really getting any smaller. And the race pace at the start of the year, Magnussen was doing much better than Hülkenberg, which I wasn't surprised by. Hulkenberg's still getting used to the new tires, but the last couple of races, Hulkenberg has been, I think, equal or better than Magnussen in the races, on top of being much better in qualifying. So I do think there is a chance that they could replace him, and I think if Perez is available, if Red Bull choose not to bring back Perez for next year, I do think Haas would be very happy to bring him in to replace Magnussen, and you basically have you would reunite the 2014 to 2016 Force India team. So those are my predictions for the 2024 Formula One grid. Only one rookie in Liam Lawson, which also may be a bit low. I know with these kinds of videos, people like to project all like 3, 4, 5 different rookies coming in. But the reality is, it's for the last 3 or 4 years, it's been in waves. 2019, we had 4 rookies technically. Giovinazzi, Albon, Norris, and Russell. 2020, we only had Latifi. 2021, we had Mazepin, Schumacher, and Tsunoda. 2022, we only had Zhou. This coming year, we had Piastri, Sargent, and where's the third one? Oh yeah, and then De Vries, who's already lost his seat. So it's basically been 4, 1, 3, 1, 3. So in theory, this year should probably be another down year, which I wouldn't be surprised by if we only had one rookie for next year. So that's all for my predictions for the 2024 Formula One grid. Please leave your thoughts in the comment section down below. Who do you think will be on the grid? Which rookies do you think will be on the grid, and who do you think will be out of a seat at the end of the silly season? Thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.